From a young girl taken captive in the desert to the haunting final moments of World War II, here are some of the most eerie and forgotten moments captured in colorized photos. Olive Oatman had an unimaginable experience that began in 1851 while traveling with her family through what is now Arizona. They were ambushed by Native Americans who killed her family. She witnessed this horror firsthand, but her ordeal was far from over. The attackers took Olive captive and later traded her to the Mohave people. President Abraham Lincoln visited the battlefield at Antietam, Maryland on October 3, 1862. He stood there with Allan Pinkerton, a man who would go on to create the Secret Service, and Major General John A. McClernand. In November 1864, African-American Union soldiers stood strong at Dutch Gap, Virginia. They were part of a military force that had only recently been allowed to serve in the Union Army. Marilyn Monroe had many portraits taken, but one photograph captured by Richard Avedon stands out as one of the most honest representations of the star. Her beauty and vulnerability were captured in this image, which some believe shows her true self. Marilyn Monroe became a symbol of Hollywood glamour, but this photo also hinted at the sadness behind the smile. Albert Einstein in 1921 was already a legend in the making. His theories of relativity had changed how people understood the universe. But this is just the beginning. Later, you'll discover the surprising battles they had to fight for true freedom. Robert McGee was just a 13-year-old orphan when he was attacked by the Sioux tribe in 1864. The attack left him with a terrible wound. He was scalped, a punishment that left him scarred for life. But Robert survived, a testament to his strength. His experience became a part of the history of the American West, a place where survival came at a high cost. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was captured in a chilling photograph from 1937. He was watching over his daughters as they gave the Heil Hitler salute during a state Christmas party in Berlin. Al Capone, the notorious gangster, was arrested in 1930 while trying to enter Miami, Florida. The police were determined to keep him out, knowing the chaos that followed in his wake. Capone had become infamous during the Prohibition era, but even after that period ended, his criminal activities continued to make headlines. Buffalo Bill Cody was a showman of the Wild West, and in 1886, he posed with some of his Pawnee and Sioux performers on Staten Island, New York. The image captured the spirit of the Wild West show, a spectacle that brought the drama and adventure of the frontier to audiences across the United States and even Europe. A portrait of a Greek Orthodox priest immigrant taken at Ellis Island in the 1910s captures a different kind of journey. This man, like so many others, had traveled across the ocean to start a new life in America. Ellis Island was the gateway for millions of immigrants, each with their own story of hope and hardship. The Hindenburg disaster of May 6, 1937 was a tragic end to the era of airships. The German airship burst into flames as it tried to land in Manchester Township, New Jersey. The fire was caused by static electricity, which ignited the hydrogen gas used to keep the craft afloat. During World War II, a pair of African-American troops posed by artillery in 1944. They were part of the war effort, serving their country even as they faced discrimination at home. Iron White Man was a Sioux Indian who was part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. His portrait, preserved in a photograph, shows him dressed in traditional clothing, a symbol of his culture. But his presence in the show also reflects the complex relationship between Native Americans and the expanding United States, where entertainment often clashed with reality. A staged photo of a samurai's suicide ritual, known as seppuku, was taken in the late 19th century. This photograph, though staged, represents a real practice in Japanese history. Seppuku was a way for samurai to die with honor rather than face dishonor in defeat. The ritual was both brutal and dignified, showing the warrior code that shaped the lives of the samurai. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie left the Sarajevo Guildhall on June 28, 1914. Minutes later, they were assassinated, an event that would spark the beginning of World War I. The photograph of them in their carriage is haunting, knowing what would happen next. In the late 19th century, a group of men and women stood in an alley known as Bandit's Roost off Mulberry Street in Manhattan. The area was notorious for its crime and poverty, and photographer Jacob Riis captured the gritty reality of life in the slums. His work helped to expose the harsh conditions faced by the urban poor and eventually led to reforms aimed at improving the living conditions in New York City. In December 1933, bar patrons raised their glasses to toast the end of Prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol had lasted for 13 years, but its end was celebrated with a sense of relief and joy. The era of speakeasies and bootleggers was over, and the country could return to a more open relationship with alcohol. A British cavalry sergeant major was photographed instructing an American soldier at Camp Dick in Texas. After the Civil War, many freed slaves moved westward in search of a new life. They hoped to leave behind the painful memories of slavery, but also sought to create a better future for themselves in the American West. In 1908, a fireman in London wore a smoke helmet while on duty. Alfred Hitchcock directed many iconic films, but his work on The Birds, released in 1963, is remembered for its suspense and innovation. Hitchcock's direction brought the tension of the story to life, making audiences feel the terror of being attacked by a seemingly ordinary creature. Soviet soldiers charged during the siege of Leningrad in 1943. The siege was one of the longest and deadliest of World War II, lasting for over 2 years. Children in New York City were photographed licking a massive block of ice on a hot day in July 1912. This image captures a simple moment of relief from the summer heat, but it also shows the ingenuity of children in finding ways to stay cool. In a time before air conditioning, ice was a valuable commodity, and a block of it could bring joy to an entire neighborhood. But Geronimo's 1887 one photograph captures more than just a leader. Keep watching to find out. During the Dust Bowl in April 1936, a young boy walked amid the dust in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. The Dust Bowl was a devastating environmental disaster that struck the Great Plains during the 1930s, displacing thousands of families and ruining millions of acres of farmland. Soldiers of the Royal Irish Rifles were photographed during the Battle of Somme in World War I. The battle was one of the largest and deadliest of the war, with millions of men fighting in the trenches. In 1947, Laura Bell Devlin was arrested in Newark, Ohio, after murdering and dismembering her 75-year-old husband with a hacksaw. The mugshot taken after her arrest shows a woman who appears calm, but the details of her crime reveal a much darker reality. The Harlem Hellfighters were a unit of African-American soldiers who served in World War I. Officially known as the 369th Infantry Regiment, they fought with distinction, earning a reputation for bravery and determination. Despite facing racism and discrimination from their own countrymen, the Harlem Hellfighters proved themselves on the battlefield, earning numerous awards for their service. Booker T. Washington, a prominent African-American leader, was photographed sitting at his desk, writing. Washington was an influential educator and founder of the Tuskegee Institute, a school dedicated to providing vocational education to African Americans in the post-Civil War South. In 1947, mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was killed by an unknown assailant who shot him through a window while he was staying at an associate's house in Beverly Hills. The photograph of his body lying on a couch with blood staining the fabric captures the violent end of one of the most infamous figures in organized crime. Siegel had been involved with the creation of the Las Vegas casino empire, but his murder remains unsolved. Chief John Smith, known as Kabi Nagwiwens or Wrinkle Meat, was a Native American from the Chippewa tribe in Cass Lake, Minnesota. His age was contested, but some reports claimed he lived to be 137 before dying in 1922. An overhead photo of the D-Day landings in Normandy, France during World War II shows the scale of the Allied invasion. On June 6, 1944, thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen participated in the operation that would mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Inside the Table Bluff Hotel and Saloon in Humboldt County, California in 1889, patrons sat in a scene that could have come from any small town in the Old West. The saloon was a gathering place for locals and travelers alike, where deals were made and stories were told over a glass of whiskey. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 was one of the deadliest days in American history, with over 22,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in just one day. The Confederate dead lay strewn across the battlefield after the fighting subsided, their bodies a stark reminder of the war's brutal cost. The Battle of Antietam is remembered not just for its staggering casualties, but also because it gave President Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that changed the course of the Civil War by making the abolition of slavery a central goal of the Union's war effort. The Golden Gate Bridge is an iconic symbol of San Francisco, but its construction in the 1930s was an engineering marvel at the time. The photograph of the bridge during its construction shows the immense scale of the project, with workers laboring high above the water to create what would become one of the most recognizable structures in the world. In 1963, the world was shocked by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Just 2 days later, the man accused of killing him, Lee Harvey Oswald, was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby while being transferred to another jail. The photograph of Oswald, taken shortly before his death, shows him in a moment of calm before the chaos that would follow. The assassination of Kennedy and the subsequent killing of Oswald remain subjects of debate and conspiracy theories to this day. In 1932, during the Great Depression, a famous photograph was taken of construction workers having lunch atop a steel beam on the RCA building in Rockefeller Center, New York City. Known as lunch atop a skyscraper, the image shows the men casually sitting over 800 feet above the ground, seemingly unbothered by the dizzying height. The Brooklyn end of the Manhattan Bridge, still under construction in 1908, represents a time of rapid urbanization and technological progress in the early 20th century. The bridge, which would eventually connect Manhattan and Brooklyn, was a critical infrastructure project that helped shape New York City into the metropolis it is today. The photograph captures the bridge in its incomplete state, a work in progress that symbolizes the broader transformation of the city as it grew and evolved into a global center of commerce and culture. The famous Apache leader Geronimo, photographed around 1887, is a figure who represents the fierce resistance of Native Americans to the encroachment of settlers on their lands. Geronimo led his people in a series of conflicts against the U.S. government, refusing to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. Charles Darwin, best known as the father of the theory of evolution, was a legendary scientist whose work changed the way we understand the natural world. His groundbreaking book, On the Origin of Species, introduced the idea that species evolve over time through natural selection, challenging the prevailing views of the time. Now, before we continue, just don't forget to give this video a like and also hit that subscribe button for more such content in the future. Grigory Rasputin was a mysterious and controversial figure in Russian history. He was born in Siberia around 1869, and as a young man he became known as a mystic and healer. His life took a significant turn when he gained favor with the Romanov family, particularly with Tsarina Alexandra. Rasputin claimed to have healing powers, and his influence grew when he seemingly eased the symptoms of the Tsar's son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. This association with the royal family allowed Rasputin to gain political power in Russia, but his involvement in state matters made him many enemies. In the early 1900s, New York City was a bustling hub of activity. The city was growing rapidly, and markets were an essential part of daily life. In 1976, David Bowie was arrested in Rochester, New York, for marijuana possession. This event took place after a performance, and Bowie was with 3 others, including Iggy Pop. While the charges were eventually dropped, Bowie never returned to Rochester to perform again. The mugshot of David Bowie from this incident is iconic, showing the rock star at the height of his fame. Keep watching to discover a surprising detail that hides in the face of a man who would soon become a Wild West legend. Central Park in New York City has always been a refuge for city dwellers. In 1933, as the country was deep in the Great Depression, the park offered a place of respite for people facing tough times. The beauty of Central Park contrasted with the hardships people were enduring, making it a vital space for recreation and relaxation. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 was met with celebrations across the United States. After 13 years of outlawing alcohol, the city was ready to raise a glass again. In one photograph, a crowd is seen holding up their drinks in a newly opened bar, toasting the end of prohibition. This moment captured the joy and relief that came with the return of legal drinking. In 1915, a failed robbery attempt in New York City ended in tragedy. 2 thieves, Robert Greene and Jacob Jagendorf, fell to their deaths down an elevator shaft while trying to escape. Their bodies were discovered at the bottom of the shaft. The 1930s were a time of great hardship for many Americans, especially those affected by the Dust Bowl. In 1936, a family of migrant workers fleeing the drought in Oklahoma was photographed camping by the roadside in Blythe, California. This image of a family on the move reflects the struggles of people who were displaced by environmental and economic factors. The Dust Bowl forced many families to leave their homes and seek work elsewhere, often traveling great distances with little more than hope to guide them. The Irish Guards, a regiment of the British Army, were known for their bravery during World War I. In 1917, they were photographed resting between carrying duckboards near Langemarck, Belgium. The soldiers had been through some of the worst fighting on the Western Front, but they remained steadfast in their duty. When news of the Titanic disaster reached London, it caused a sensation. A young boy was photographed selling newspapers that contained reports on the sinking. The Titanic was supposed to be an unsinkable ship, but it went down on its maiden voyage in April 1912 after hitting an iceberg. The tragedy shocked the world, as more than 1,500 people lost their lives. The image of the boys selling newspapers shows how quickly news traveled, and even in an age before the internet and social media. The Battle of Verdun was one of the most brutal and deadly battles of World War I. French soldiers were photographed on the battlefield during an offensive on the fortress of Verdun. The battle, which lasted from February to December 1916, resulted in over 700,000 casualties, with both French and German forces suffering immense losses. In 1913, Civil War veterans gathered to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Two veterans, one from the Union and one from the Confederacy, were photographed exchanging stories during the event. In 1909, Connecticut newsboys were photographed on the job, some of them having worked as newsboys for 8 or 9 years. These young boys were part of a larger group of children who worked to support their families during a time when child labor was common. Selling newspapers on the streets was a tough job, but these boys were resilient, doing whatever they could to make ends meet. In 1940, Adolf Hitler was photographed saluting passing German soldiers during their campaign in Poland. This image represents a moment of triumph for the Nazi regime, but it also foreshadows the horrors that were to come. Hitler's invasion of Poland marked the beginning of World War II, a conflict that would engulf the world and lead to the deaths of millions. During the Great Depression, shantytowns, often called Hoovervilles, sprang up in cities across the United States. In 1933, one of these shantytowns was photographed in Central Park, New York City. These makeshift dwellings were a stark contrast to the wealth and grandeur of the surrounding city, showing the deep divide between the haves and the have-nots. The people who lived in these shantytowns were struggling to survive in a time of economic collapse, but they also represented the resilience of the human spirit, as they found ways to endure even in the face of extreme poverty. In 1910, a horse-drawn fire engine was photographed racing toward a blaze at 72nd Street and Broadway in New York City. Ellis Island was the gateway to America for millions of immigrants in the early 20th century. A series of portraits taken of immigrants upon their arrival at Ellis Island offers a glimpse into the diverse backgrounds of those who sought a new life in the United States. Joe Masseria was a notorious mafia kingpin in New York during the early 20th century. In 1931, Masseria was murdered in a Coney Island restaurant on the orders of fellow gangster Charles Lucky Luciano. The famous photograph shows Masseria's body slumped over a table holding the ace of spades, often referred to as the death card. In 1946, children in West Harlem, New York, were photographed playing in the street, joining hands in a circle. This image captures the innocence and joy of childhood, even in a time when the city was still recovering from the effects of World War II. Wyatt Earp is one of the most famous lawmen of the Wild West. A photograph of a young Wyatt Earp from around 1870, when he was just 21 years old, shows a man who would go on to become a legend in American history. Earp's reputation as a tough and fearless lawman was cemented by his involvement in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. In 1865, Lewis Powell, a 21-year-old conspirator in the plot to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln, was photographed in a cell aboard a U.S. Navy ship in Washington, D.C. Powell had attempted to murder Secretary of State William H. Seward as part of the larger conspiracy orchestrated by John Wilkes Booth. Later, Escobar's mugshot hides a shocking truth behind his smile. What dark secret could this seemingly casual photo reveal? In April 1941, children in Chicago lined up for an Easter Sunday matinee. This photograph captures a moment of anticipation and excitement as the children waited to see a movie. In 1937, flood victims in Kentucky lined up for Red Cross relief during one of the worst natural disasters in American history. The Ohio River flood devastated several states, leaving thousands homeless. The photograph of people waiting for aid shows the reliance of those affected by the flood as they stood in line for basic necessities. On July 4, 1939, baseball great Lou Gehrig delivered his famous "The Luckiest Man on the Face of the Earth" speech at Yankee Stadium. Gehrig had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a disease that would soon take his life. In March 1964, Malcolm X was photographed waiting for a press conference to begin. This image captures the civil rights leader at a critical moment in his life, as he was beginning to distance himself from the Nation of Islam and embrace a more inclusive approach to the fight for racial justice. The Battle of Saipan in 1944 was one of the most brutal engagements of World War II in the Pacific. A photograph of the battle shows an injured Japanese father and child, highlighting the human cost of the conflict. During the Great Depression, many people expressed their frustrations with the government and the economic situation through public protests. One photograph from the early 1930s shows an unemployed man holding a sign that reads, "I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, and no work for 3 months, but I only want 1 job." Marie Sklodowska-Curie was a pioneering scientist who made groundbreaking discoveries in the field of radioactivity. A photograph of Curie in her laboratory in France shows a woman who was dedicated to her work, despite the challenges she faced as a female scientist in a male-dominated field. In the last years of his life, American novelist Mark Twain was photographed, showing a man who had seen and experienced much in his lifetime. Twain was one of America's most beloved writers, known for his wit and humor, but also for his keen observations on human nature. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C., calling for an end to racial discrimination and for equality for all people. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s displaced thousands of families, many of whom became migrant workers traveling around the country in search of work. A photograph from 1936 shows a migrant worker sitting with her children in Nimpomo, California. Around 1900, Mulberry Street in Manhattan was a bustling area filled with immigrants and street vendors. A photograph of Mulberry Street from this time shows a vibrant community where people from different backgrounds came together to make a living. In 1930, a laborer was photographed working on the frame of the Empire State Building, one of the most iconic buildings in New York City. A photograph from around 1865 shows a Nihang bodyguard serving as the ruler of Hyderabad's army located in what is now present-day India. The Nihangs were Sikh warriors known for their martial skills, distinct blue attire, and fearless demeanor. In 1945, as World War II came to a close, a photograph was taken of an old German woman walking through the smoking ruins of Berlin after the city had been captured by the Red Army. In 1977, a mugshot was taken of Pablo Escobar, the infamous Colombian drug lord responsible for much of the world's cocaine supply during the 1970s and 1980s. Escobar was a ruthless criminal who had built an empire based on violence, corruption, and narcotics trafficking. But what about a mysterious photo from the 1930s, an immigrant family staring at the Statue of Liberty? In 1954, a photograph of Jackie Robinson shows the baseball legend during his time with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Robinson was the first African American to play Major League Baseball in the modern era, breaking the color barrier in 1947. During the Great Depression, many Americans were left destitute and in need of assistance. In 1931, unemployed men gathered outside a Chicago soup kitchen run by none other than gangster Al Capone. Capone, known for his involvement in organized crime, used his wealth to provide food for the hungry during the economic crisis. The Christmas Truce of 1914 is one of the most remarkable events of World War I. Soldiers on both sides of the Western Front laid down their arms and engaged in unofficial ceasefires during the Christmas season. In 1939, at the start of World War II, a photograph was taken of a 12-year-old Polish girl who was killed during a German air raid in Warsaw. In 1959, protesters in Little Rock, Arkansas, demonstrated against the integration of schools following the landmark Brown and Board of Education decision. In the mid-19th century, one of the most significant events in American history occurred. It was the Civil War that ultimately reshaped the nation. One of the key moments during this period was when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. This event took place on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. This act effectively ended the Civil War, which had raged on for 4 long years. Meanwhile, in the western part of the country, a different type of fever was sweeping across California. The gold rush, which began in 1848, had brought thousands of people to San Francisco. A photograph of Portsmouth Square in 1851 captures a moment from this era, showing how the discovery of gold transformed the sleepy town into a bustling city almost overnight. Moving forward to the 20th century, World War II was another transformative period in history. A poignant photograph from February 1943 shows a Soviet soldier standing guard behind a captured German soldier during the Battle of Stalingrad. The battle was one of the deadliest in history, and after months of fierce fighting, the remnants of the German 6th Army were forced to surrender. In the early 20th century, back in the United States, New York City was undergoing rapid urbanization and growth. A remarkable photograph from 1930 shows 2 waiters serving lunch to steelworkers who were perched on a girder high above the city. These men were involved in the construction of Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a symbol of luxury and modernity at the time. In another part of New York, Ellis Island was the first stop for many immigrants arriving in the United States in the early 20th century. A photo from the 1930s shows an immigrant family looking across New York Harbor at the Statue of Liberty. The 20th century also witnessed great technological advancements. The Wright brothers were pioneers in aviation, and a photograph from 1902 shows Wilbur Wright gliding in a flying machine that predated their historic first flight. In the latter part of the century, the impact of World War II was felt around the world. On May 2, 1945, Red Army soldiers raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag during the Battle of Berlin. This event symbolized the fall of Nazi Germany and the end of the war in Europe. The Soviet Union's victory over the Nazis was a turning point in the war, and the image of the flag being raised over the Reichstag became an iconic representation of the Allied victory. But if you think this is the only secret history holds, then I think you should watch this video on your right-hand side.